In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal history whispered through ancient stones, Queen Elizabeth II sat alone in her private study. The weight of 7 decades on the throne had never felt heavier than in the weeks following Prince Philip's funeral. At 95, she had weathered wars, scandals, and constitutional crises, but nothing had prepared her for the profound loneliness that now settled into her bones like winter frost. The woman who had devoted her entire life to duty and service found herself questioning whether the sacrifices had been worth it, especially when it came to her family. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that would become anything but ordinary, a simple wooden box arrived that would change everything she thought she knew about forgiveness, love, and the unbreakable bonds that tie a grandmother to her grandson, even across an ocean of hurt and misunderstanding. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle's private apartments, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had witnessed decades of royal family gatherings. Queen Elizabeth II moved slowly through her morning routine, each step measured and deliberate, as if the very act of moving forward required conscious effort. The silence that had become her constant companion since Philip's death seemed particularly heavy today, broken only by the distant sound of staff preparing for another day of constitutional duties. Sarah, her longtime dresser, noticed the Queen's unusual stillness as she helped arrange her pearls. "Your Majesty, you seem particularly thoughtful this morning," she ventured carefully, knowing that the Queen rarely shared her private thoughts but sometimes appreciated the gentle inquiry of those who had served her faithfully for years. Elizabeth caught her own reflection in the ornate mirror, seeing not the monarch the world knew but simply a woman approaching her 96th birthday, carrying the accumulated weight of loss and estrangement. "I find myself thinking about birthdays past, Sarah. How different they were when Philip was here, when the children were young, when the family gathered without the shadow of obligation hanging over everything." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Angela Kelly, the Queen's personal assistant and confidant, entered with her usual efficient grace but carrying something unexpected, a modestly sized package wrapped in simple brown paper, devoid of the elaborate presentation that typically accompanied gifts intended for the sovereign. "Your Majesty, this arrived by special courier this morning. It's marked as personal, from Prince Harry." Angela's voice carried a note of surprise that she couldn't quite conceal. In the months since Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties and their subsequent interviews, personal communications between the Queen and her grandson had been limited to brief, formal exchanges. Elizabeth's hands stilled on her pearls. The mention of Harry's name brought with it a complex mixture of emotions: love, disappointment, hope, and a deep sadness that had settled in her heart since the family rift had become so publicly painful. She had raised Harry from the tender age of 12, when Diana's death had shattered his world, and, despite all the recent turmoil, her love for him remained as constant as the tides. "Leave it on the desk, please, Angela. I'll attend to it presently." The Queen's voice maintained its characteristic composure, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tremor that suggested deeper feelings beneath the surface. After her staff had departed to attend to their duties, Elizabeth found herself alone with the package. She approached it slowly, as if it might contain either a treasure or a painful reminder of how far apart her family had grown. The brown paper wrapping was modest, almost humble, so different from the elaborate presentations that usually accompanied royal gifts. There was something authentic about its simplicity that spoke to her in a way that formal gestures never could. With careful fingers, she unwrapped the package to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden box, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. The wood appeared to be English oak, polished to a gentle luster that spoke of skilled craftsmanship rather than expensive materials. There was no ornate decoration, no precious metals or jewels, just the natural beauty of the wood grain and the obvious care that had gone into its creation. A small envelope was attached to the box, and Elizabeth recognized Harry's handwriting immediately, the same careful script she had helped him practice as a young boy during their quiet moments together at Balmoral. Her heart caught slightly as she opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of cream-colored paper. "Dearest Granny," the letter began, using the informal address that had always been reserved for their private moments. "I hope this finds you in good health and spirits, though I know these past months have been incredibly difficult for you. I've been thinking about you constantly, especially as your birthday approaches, and I wanted to send you something that I hope will bring you some small measure of comfort during this challenging time." The Queen paused in her reading, surprised by the warmth and obvious care in Harry's words. Despite the distance and the painful public statements, there was something in his tone that reminded her of the boy who had sought comfort in her presence during his darkest moments. "This box contains something very special to me, something I've treasured since childhood but feel you should have now." Inside, you'll find a collection of voice recordings that Grandpapa made for me over the years, bedtime stories, advice about life, silly jokes that made me laugh when I was feeling sad, and conversations we had during some of our walks together. Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise and recognition. She remembered Philip's fascination with recording technology, his delight in capturing family moments, and his particular pleasure in creating special recordings for the grandchildren. She had always known he made these recordings, but she had never heard them herself, considering them to be private treasures shared between grandfather and grandchildren. After Grandpapa passed away, Harry's letter continued, I realized that these recordings aren't just precious memories for me, they're the essence of who he was as a grandfather, a husband, and a man who loved his family more than anything in the world. I think you should have them now because they capture the side of him that perhaps only we, his family, truly knew. The Philip who could be silly and tender, who told jokes that weren't always funny but made us laugh because of how much he enjoyed telling them, who had advice for every situation and wasn't afraid to share his wisdom, even when we weren't particularly interested in hearing it. The Queen found herself smiling through sudden tears as she read these words. Harry had captured something essential about Philip that public eulogies and formal tributes had somehow missed, the everyday magic of a man who had devoted himself not just to duty but to the quiet, private moments that build a family's foundation. I know that things between us have been difficult, Granny, and I take responsibility for much of the pain that our decisions have caused. But, on your birthday, I wanted you to know that my love and respect for you have never wavered, and that I think about you every day. I hope these recordings will bring you comfort and perhaps help you feel close to Grandpapa in a way that feels immediate and real. The letter concluded with words that made Elizabeth's heart swell with a mixture of love and longing. Please know that Megan, Archie, Lilibet, and I think of you often and hope that one day we can find our way back to each other. Until then, please accept this gift as a token of the love that distance and disagreement can never diminish. With all my love and deepest respect, your grandson, Harry. With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the wooden box to find a small, modern digital device with simple controls, clearly chosen for ease of use, along with a set of high-quality headphones. A small instruction card, written in Harry's careful handwriting, explained how to operate the device and indicated that the recordings were organized chronologically, starting from when Harry was quite young. The Queen settled into her favorite armchair, the one where she had spent countless evenings with Philip, discussing the day's events and planning for the future. With the headphones positioned carefully, she pressed the play button and was immediately transported back in time by the sound of Philip's voice, young and vibrant, calling out cheerfully, right then, young Harry, are you ready for tonight's adventure story? What followed was a magical journey through years of bedtime stories, each one clearly crafted specifically for Harry's interests and concerns at different stages of his childhood. Philip's voice wove tales of brave knights and clever princes, but these weren't generic fairy tales. They were stories where the heroes faced challenges remarkably similar to those a young prince might encounter, dealing with public attention, finding the courage to be different, learning that true strength came from kindness rather than power. In one recording, clearly made when Harry was quite young, Philip's voice took on an exaggerated dramatic tone as he told the story of a young knight who was afraid of making mistakes in front of others. You see, young Harry, Philip's voice continued after the story ended, the bravest thing anyone can do is to be themselves, even when the whole world is watching. And if you ever forget that, you just remember that your grandfather thinks you're the most splendid boy in the world, exactly as you are. Elizabeth found herself laughing through tears as she listened to Philip attempting to explain complicated historical concepts through the lens of adventure stories, his voice animated with enthusiasm for sharing knowledge with his grandson. In one particularly charming recording, Philip could be heard struggling with what was clearly new recording equipment, muttering good-naturedly about bloody modern contraptions before launching into a story about a prince who had to learn to use new inventions to help his people. As the recordings progressed chronologically, Elizabeth could hear both voices maturing. Harry's occasional interjections and questions revealed a thoughtful, caring child grappling with complex questions about identity, duty, and finding his place in an unusual family situation. Philip's responses showed a grandfather who had clearly given deep thought to the unique challenges his grandson would face, offering wisdom that was both practical and deeply loving. One recording that particularly moved the Queen captured a conversation between Philip and a teenage Harry about handling public criticism. The thing you must understand, my boy, Philip's voice advised with gentle authority, is that people will always have opinions about what you should do, how you should behave, what kind of person you should be. But, at the end of the day, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and be proud of the choices you've made. If you've acted with integrity, if you've tried to help others, if you've been true to your values, then you've succeeded, regardless of what anyone else might say. The wisdom in those words struck Elizabeth with particular force, given the recent family tensions. She realized that Philip had been preparing Harry for exactly the kind of difficult decisions and public scrutiny that had ultimately led to his departure from royal duties. Rather than feeling betrayed by Harry's choices, she began to understand them as the natural result of Philip's own teachings about integrity and authenticity. Another recording captured Philip and Harry discussing the importance of family, with Philip's voice taking on a more serious tone as he explained the difference between the institution of the monarchy and the personal bonds that tie families together. "Remember, Harry," Philip had said, "titles and traditions are important, but they're not what make a family strong. What makes a family strong is love, forgiveness, and the willingness to support each other through difficult times, even when you don't always agree on everything." As Elizabeth listened to these intimate conversations, she began to see her grandson's recent actions in a completely different light. Rather than betrayal or rejection of family values, she heard echoes of the very principles Philip had worked so hard to instill. Harry's decision to prioritize his wife's well-being, to protect his children from unwanted attention, to speak honestly about his struggles, these weren't rejections of family teachings but rather their practical application in circumstances Philip and she had never anticipated. The final recording in the collection was clearly made much more recently, probably in the months before Philip's death. His voice, though slightly weaker, remained warm and full of love as he addressed not just Harry but his entire family. "My dear Harry, by the time you hear this, I'll likely be gone, but I want you to know that being your grandfather has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. You've grown into a man I'm enormously proud of, someone who cares deeply about others and isn't afraid to stand up for what he believes is right." Philip's voice continued with words that seemed to address the very conflicts that had torn the family apart. "I know that life will present you with difficult choices, situations where doing what's right for your family might not align perfectly with what's expected of your role. When those moments come, remember that your first duty is to be a good man, a loving husband, and a devoted father. Everything else, including royal duties, comes second to those fundamental responsibilities." The recording concluded with Philip's voice taking on the tender tone Elizabeth remembered so well from their private moments together. "Take care of yourself, my boy, and take care of that lovely wife and those beautiful children of yours. And don't forget to check on your grandmother now and then. She worries about you more than she'll ever let on, but she loves you more than words can express. We both do." As the final recording ended, Elizabeth sat in profound silence, the headphones still positioned over her ears but no longer transmitting anything except the soft whisper of her own breathing. The afternoon light had shifted during her hours of listening, painting the room in the golden hues that Philip had always loved during their evening conversations. For the first time since Philip's death, Elizabeth felt genuinely connected not just to his memory but to his living presence in the wisdom he had shared and the love he had expressed. More importantly, she felt reconnected to Harry in a way that transcended the recent pain and misunderstanding. Through Philip's voice, she had heard her grandson's true heart, his genuine care for family, and his commitment to the values they had all worked to instill in him. The gift was more than a collection of recordings, it was a bridge across the chasm that had opened between them, a reminder that love could survive disagreement, and proof that the bonds Philip had worked so carefully to build were stronger than any temporary conflict could break. The evening air carried a gentle chill as Elizabeth made her way through the castle corridors toward the blue drawing room, where she often spent quiet hours reflecting on the day's events. The wooden box containing Philip's recordings remained cradled in her hands, its weight somehow both substantial and comforting. She had listened to the entire collection twice now, each hearing revealing new layers of meaning and emotion that she hadn't caught during her first overwhelmed encounter with Harry's extraordinary gift. As she settled into the familiar embrace of her favorite evening chair, Elizabeth found herself contemplating how profoundly the afternoon had shifted her understanding of recent events. The public narrative surrounding Harry and Meghan's departure had been one of rebellion, ingratitude, and betrayal of centuries of tradition. The media had painted their decision as a selfish abandonment of duty, and even within the family, there had been hurt feelings and accusations of disloyalty. But Philip's recorded wisdom had illuminated something entirely different. Through his grandfather's voice, Harry had revealed himself not as a rebellious prince rejecting his heritage, but as a young man trying desperately to honor the deeper values his family had taught him while navigating unprecedented challenges in a rapidly changing world. Elizabeth thought back to her own youth, to the moment when her father's unexpected death had thrust her onto the throne at 25, forcing her to balance personal desires with constitutional duty. The weight of that responsibility had shaped every decision she had made for the following 7 decades. but listening to Philip's advice to Harry about prioritizing family above institutional expectations made her realize that perhaps the circumstances her grandson faced were fundamentally different from her own. When she had ascended the throne, the world had been a different place. The media had been more deferential, public scrutiny less invasive, and the pace of change more gradual. Harry had come of age in an era of social media, instant global communication, and relentless public examination of every aspect of royal life. More importantly, he had experienced the devastating loss of his mother, partly as a result of media intrusion, in a way that had shaped his understanding of the potential dangers facing his own family. The Queen reached for the small device again, scrolling to one particular recording that had struck her most powerfully during her second listening session. It was a conversation between Philip and a young adult Harry, probably recorded during one of their walks at Balmoral, discussing the nature of service and duty. "Grandpapa," Harry's voice could be heard asking, "sometimes I feel like I'm being pulled in different directions. Everyone has opinions about what I should do, how I should serve, what kind of life I should lead. How do you know when you're making the right choice?" Philip's response had been characteristically thoughtful and direct. "The right choice, Harry, is usually the one that allows you to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that you've acted with integrity and put the people you love most at the center of your decisions. Service to others is important, yes, but if that service requires you to sacrifice the well-being of your wife or children, then you're not serving anyone well." The wisdom in those words resonated with Elizabeth in a way that surprised her. Throughout her own reign, she had sometimes wondered about the personal costs of absolute dedication to duty. She had missed important moments with her own children, delegated much of their upbringing to others, and maintained a level of emotional distance that the requirements of monarchy seemed to demand. But Philip's advice to Harry suggested a different approach, one that didn't require choosing between love and service but rather found ways to honor both. Perhaps Harry's decision to step back from full-time royal duties wasn't a rejection of service but rather a redefinition of it, an attempt to serve in a way that didn't require sacrificing his family's well-being. Elizabeth's thoughts turned to Meghan, and she felt a pang of regret about how the family had handled the challenges of integrating someone from such a different background into their traditional structure. Listening to Philip's recordings, she could hear his emphasis on the importance of protecting and supporting the people Harry loved. The Queen realized that in focusing on institutional concerns and traditional protocols, the family had perhaps failed to adequately support Meghan during her difficult transition into royal life. She remembered her own early years as Queen, when she had felt overwhelmed by the expectations and protocols surrounding her new role. But she had grown up within the system, understanding its rhythms and requirements from childhood. Meghan had entered their world as an adult, with established career success and life experience, only to find herself subjected to unprecedented scrutiny and criticism while simultaneously being expected to abandon much of what had made her successful and fulfilled. The recordings revealed that Philip had clearly understood the unique challenges Meghan would face. In one conversation with Harry, he had offered advice about supporting a partner who was struggling with the pressures of royal life. "Marriage is about creating a united front against the world," Philip had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated similar challenges with Elizabeth herself. "When your wife is being criticized or attacked, your job isn't to explain why the criticism might be valid or to ask her to endure it for the sake of tradition. Your job is to stand beside her, protect her, and create a space where she can flourish as herself." Those words stung Elizabeth with recognition. She remembered how Philip had protected her during her early years as Queen, how he had sacrificed his naval career to support her, how he had shouldered much of the criticism and controversy so that she could focus on her constitutional role. Perhaps Harry had been trying to do the same thing for Meghan, and the family had misunderstood his protective instincts as disloyalty. As the evening deepened, Elizabeth found herself thinking about her great-grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, whom she had seen so little of due to the family estrangement. Through the recordings, she could hear Philip's delight in his great-grandchildren, his excitement about their personalities and development. He had clearly maintained a relationship with them that transcended the formal boundaries that had seemed to complicate other family interactions. One recording captured Philip talking to Harry about the importance of allowing children to develop their own identities, free from excessive pressure about their future roles. "Let them be children first," Philip had advised. "Let them discover who they are, what they're passionate about, what kind of people they want to become. The world will put enough expectations on them soon enough. Your job as their father is to give them the foundation of love and confidence they'll need to handle whatever comes next." Elizabeth realized that Harry's desire to provide his children with as normal a childhood as possible wasn't a rejection of their royal heritage but, rather, an attempt to give them the kind of foundation Philip had advocated. Perhaps living in California, away from the intense scrutiny of the British media, was Harry's way of ensuring his children could develop their own identities before having to navigate the complex world of public duty. The Queen's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Angela Kelly entered quietly, carrying the evening's correspondence and a pot of tea, noticing immediately the tear tracks on the Queen's cheeks and the emotional intensity that seemed to fill the room. "Your Majesty, are you quite all right?" Angela asked with the gentle concern of someone who had been a trusted companion through many of the Queen's most challenging moments. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes bright with a mixture of sadness and something that might have been hope. "I think I'm beginning to understand something important, Angela. Something I should have understood much sooner." Angela set down the tea service and waited quietly, recognizing that the Queen was processing something significant and might need to talk through her thoughts. "I've been listening to Philip's recordings for Harry," Elizabeth continued, her voice thoughtful and measured. "They've made me realize that perhaps we've been looking at recent events through the wrong lens entirely. What if Harry's decisions weren't acts of rebellion but rather attempts to honor the very values we tried to teach him?" Angela had served the royal family long enough to understand the delicate nature of family dynamics and the complexity of the recent situation with Harry and Meghan. She had witnessed the Queen's private anguish over the estrangement, even as Her Majesty had maintained public composure and official silence. "Your Majesty, if I may say so, it's never too late to reach out to family, especially when love remains strong on both sides," Angela offered gently. Elizabeth nodded, her mind already turning to possibilities she hadn't considered before. "Philip always said that pride was the enemy of happiness, that being right was less important than being loving. I think perhaps it's time I put that wisdom into practice." The Queen spent the remainder of the evening listening to selected recordings again, this time focusing not just on the content but on the tone of love and acceptance that colored every interaction between Philip and Harry. She could hear in Philip's voice the kind of unconditional support that had characterized his approach to family relationships, the way he had managed to maintain individual connections with each family member while supporting the institution of the monarchy. As she prepared for bed, Elizabeth made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She would write to Harry, not as the Queen responding to a subject, but as a grandmother writing to her beloved grandson. She would thank him for the gift, acknowledge the wisdom in Philip's recorded advice, and, perhaps most importantly, express her desire to bridge the distance that had grown between them. The letter would be difficult to write, requiring her to acknowledge mistakes and missed opportunities while expressing hope for future reconciliation. But, listening to Philip's voice had reminded her that the strongest families were built not on avoiding conflict but on having the courage to address it with love and honesty. Before retiring, Elizabeth made one more decision. She would ask Angela to arrange a secure video call with Harry, Meghan, and the children. She wanted to thank Harry personally for the gift, to see her great-grandchildren, and to begin the process of rebuilding the relationships that Philip's recordings had shown her were too precious to lose to misunderstanding and pride. The wooden box sat on her bedside table, a tangible reminder that love could survive distance and disagreement, that wisdom shared across generations could illuminate paths forward, and that sometimes the most profound gifts came not wrapped in expensive paper but in simple, heartfelt gestures that spoke directly to the heart. As she settled into sleep, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation she hadn't felt in months. Philip's voice had shown her a way forward, and Harry's thoughtful gift had provided the bridge she needed to begin building connections that had seemed impossible just hours before. The path to reconciliation might be complex, but, for the first time since the family rift had become public, the Queen felt genuinely hopeful that healing was possible. The morning following Elizabeth's profound encounter with Harry's gift dawned crisp and clear, with early spring sunlight streaming through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle. For the first time in months, the Queen had awakened feeling genuinely refreshed, as if a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying had been lifted from her shoulders during the night. As Sarah helped her dress for the day, Elizabeth found herself humming softly, a habit that had been absent since Philip's death but had returned unbidden as she anticipated the conversation she hoped to have. The wooden box containing the recording sat prominently on her writing desk, where she had placed it the evening before, and its presence seemed to infuse the room with possibilities that had been absent for far too long. "Your Majesty seems particularly bright this morning," Sarah observed with the gentle familiarity of decades of service. "If I may say so, there's a lightness about you that we haven't seen in some time." Elizabeth paused in arranging her jewelry, catching her own reflection in the mirror and, seeing something she hadn't noticed in months, a spark of anticipation in her eyes, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the daily requirements of constitutional duty. I think, Sarah, that sometimes the most important gifts are the ones that help us see familiar things in entirely new ways. Yesterday brought such a gift, and today I hope to make good use of the clarity it has provided. After breakfast, Elizabeth retreated to her private study with a specific purpose in mind. She had decided to write to Harry before attempting any direct communication, wanting to carefully consider her words and ensure that her response to his gift conveyed the depth of her appreciation and the sincerity of her desire to rebuild their relationship. Settling at her personal writing desk, the same one where she had penned countless letters over the decades, Elizabeth began what would prove to be one of the most important pieces of correspondence of her reign. Unlike the formal communications that typically characterized royal exchanges, this letter would be written from the heart of a grandmother to her grandson. "My dearest Harry," she began, using the informal salutation that felt natural after listening to hours of Philip's affectionate recordings. "I hope this letter finds you, Meghan, and the children in good health and happiness. I wanted to write immediately upon receiving your remarkable birthday gift, as it has affected me more profoundly than I think you could have anticipated." Elizabeth paused, considering how to convey the transformative impact of the recordings without overwhelming Harry with emotion or expectations. She wanted him to understand that the gift had changed her perspective fundamentally while also expressing her gratitude in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. "The collection of recordings you shared has been a revelation to me in ways I am still discovering." To hear Philip's voice again, not in formal speeches or public appearances, but in those intimate moments when he was simply being a grandfather, has been an extraordinary comfort during these difficult months. "But, more than that, listening to his conversations with you has helped me understand so much about recent events that I had perhaps viewed through too narrow a lens." The Queen found herself writing with unusual fluency, the words flowing naturally as she attempted to bridge the gap between her formal role and her personal feelings. She realized that she had spent so many decades maintaining the careful balance between public and private identity that she had sometimes lost sight of the simple human connections that made life meaningful. "Through Philip's wisdom and your questions, I've come to see that the difficult decisions you and Meghan have made were not rejections of family values but rather attempts to live by the deeper principles we hope to instill in you. Philip's advice about prioritizing the well-being of those you love most, about having the courage to forge your own path when circumstances require it, about protecting your family from harm, these were not merely words to him, but principles he lived by throughout his life with me." As she continued writing, Elizabeth found herself addressing the family tensions that had caused so much pain for everyone involved. She realized that healing required not just acknowledgement of the current situation but honest reflection on how they had arrived at this point of estrangement. "I want to acknowledge that we, as a family and as an institution, could have done better in supporting you both during the transition into royal life. The challenges Meghan faced were unprecedented in many ways, and perhaps we were too focused on traditional approaches when innovation and adaptation were what the situation required. I particularly regret that you felt unable to share your struggles with me directly, though I understand now why open communication felt impossible given the broader context of public scrutiny and institutional pressure." The letter continued with Elizabeth's growing understanding of Harry's protective instincts toward his wife and children, informed by Philip's recorded wisdom about the primacy of family relationships over institutional obligations. "Listening to Philip's advice about marriage and parenthood has reminded me of the sacrifices he made to support me during the early years of my reign, and how his willingness to put our family's needs first actually strengthened rather than weakened my ability to serve effectively. I see now that your decisions to step back from full-time royal duties were made from similar motivations, not to abandon service but to create the foundation of family security that would allow you to serve authentically and sustainably." Elizabeth took particular care in addressing her relationship with her great-grandchildren, recognizing that this was perhaps the most painful aspect of the family estrangement for everyone involved. "I think constantly about Archie and Lilibet, and I am deeply sorry that our family conflicts have limited my opportunity to know them as their great-grandmother rather than as a distant royal figure. Philip's recordings have reminded me of the joy he found in his relationships with all of you as grandchildren, and I realize how much I am missing by allowing pride and misunderstanding to create distance between us." As the letter neared its conclusion, Elizabeth addressed the question of future possibilities, trying to express hope without placing pressure on Harry or expecting immediate resolution of complex issues. "I would very much like to speak with you directly, when you feel ready for such a conversation. I want to thank you personally for this extraordinary gift, to hear about your life in California, and to learn more about how Archie and Lilibet are growing. More than anything, I want you to know that my love for you has never wavered, despite the difficulties we have all navigated these past months. The Queen concluded her letter with words that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, but that now felt essential to express. Philip's recordings have reminded me that the strongest families are built on forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to admit when we have made mistakes. I am ready to have those conversations, whenever you feel prepared for them, and I hope we can begin to bridge the distance that has grown between us. Your children deserve to know their great-grandmother not as a formal figure but as someone who loves their father deeply and wants to be part of their lives in whatever way feels appropriate and comfortable for your family. After completing the letter, Elizabeth read it through several times, making small adjustments to ensure that her tone conveyed both sincerity and respect for Harry's autonomy in determining how to proceed. She wanted to extend an invitation to reconnect without creating pressure or expectations that might actually hinder reconciliation. The process of writing had been cathartic for the Queen, allowing her to articulate thoughts and feelings that had been developing since receiving Harry's gift but that she hadn't fully processed until putting them into words. She realized that the act of writing had helped her understand her own evolution in thinking about the situation. That afternoon, Elizabeth summoned Angela Kelly for a conversation about practical next steps. She wanted to send the letter quickly, while her resolve remained strong and before institutional considerations could complicate her personal intentions. Angela, I need your assistance in ensuring this letter reaches Harry securely and quickly. I want him to know that his gift has been received not just with gratitude but with the understanding he intended it to convey. Angela, who had witnessed the Queen's emotional journey over the past 24 hours, was pleased to see Her Majesty taking action that might help heal the family rift that had been a source of private anguish for so long. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll ensure it's delivered through secure diplomatic channels immediately. And, might I say, if you're planning direct communication with Prince Harry, I'd be happy to coordinate the technical arrangements for a private video call. Elizabeth nodded, appreciating Angela's anticipation of her hopes for the conversation to come. Yes, I think that would be appropriate. I want to speak with him as soon as he feels ready after receiving the letter. And, Angela, I'd very much like to see the children, even briefly, if Harry and Meghan are comfortable with that arrangement. The remainder of the day passed with Elizabeth in a state of anticipatory energy she hadn't experienced in months. She found herself revisiting Philip's recordings periodically, each time discovering new nuances in his advice and new connections to current circumstances. The gift had become more than a collection of memories, it was a roadmap for moving forward with family relationships. As evening approached, Elizabeth received confirmation that her letter had been delivered to Harry in California. The time difference meant that he would likely read it during his morning, and she found herself hoping that her words would convey the sincerity of her desire to rebuild their relationship. That night, as she prepared for bed, Elizabeth reflected on how profoundly her understanding had shifted in less than 2 days. Harry's gift had not only brought Philip's voice back into her life but had also illuminated possibilities for family healing that had seemed impossible just 48 hours earlier. The wooden box sat once again on her bedside table, and Elizabeth found herself looking forward to sharing its contents with other family members when the time felt right. Perhaps Philip's wisdom could help guide not just her relationship with Harry but broader family dynamics that had been strained by recent events. For the first time since Philip's death, Elizabeth went to sleep feeling genuinely hopeful about the future. She had taken the first steps toward rebuilding a relationship that mattered deeply to her, and she had done so guided by Philip's wisdom and Harry's generous gesture of reconciliation. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the process of family healing, she felt prepared to meet them with the love and understanding that Philip's recordings had reminded her were the foundation of all meaningful relationships. The bridge that had seemed irrevocably damaged was beginning to rebuild itself, one careful conversation at a time, with love as the foundation and forgiveness as the mortar that would make it strong enough to span any future challenges. 3 days after Elizabeth had sent her heartfelt letter across the Atlantic, Angela Kelly approached her with news that made the Queen's heart skip with anticipation. Harry had responded, and he had requested a private video call at her earliest convenience. The message, transmitted through secure diplomatic channels, was warm but cautious, expressing his gratitude for her letter and his desire to speak with her directly about the path forward for their relationship. Elizabeth had spent the intervening days in a state of nervous energy that reminded her of her younger years when important diplomatic meetings or challenging constitutional issues required careful preparation. But this was different, more personal and, somehow more significant than any state occasion she had ever navigated. This conversation would determine whether the foundation of understanding established through Philip's recordings could be built upon or whether family wounds remained too deep for immediate healing. The technical arrangements for the call had been handled with typical royal efficiency, but Elizabeth had insisted that the conversation take place in her private sitting room rather than any formal office. She wanted this to be a grandmother talking to her grandson, not a state interaction governed by protocol and ceremony. The familiar surroundings would help her maintain the personal tone that seemed essential for the kind of honest communication she hoped to achieve. As the appointed time approached, Elizabeth found herself more nervous than she had been in decades. She realized that despite 7 decades of public life, she had relatively little experience with the kind of vulnerable, emotionally honest conversation that this situation seemed to require. Her training had emphasized duty, composure, and formal interaction, but Philip's recordings had reminded her that the most important relationships required something deeper and more authentic. The wooden box containing the recordings sat nearby, a tangible reminder of the gift that had made this moment possible. Elizabeth had listened to several more of Philip's conversations with Harry that morning, drawing strength from her husband's natural ability to connect with their grandson on both intellectual and emotional levels. When the video call connected, Elizabeth saw Harry's face for the first time in many months, and she was struck by how much older he appeared, how the weight of recent experiences had added gravity to features that had once carried the carefree quality of youth. But his eyes remained kind, and, when he smiled upon seeing her, she caught a glimpse of the boy who had sought comfort in her presence during his most difficult moments. "Granny," Harry said simply, using the informal address that immediately established the personal nature of their conversation. "Thank you so much for your letter. I can't tell you how much it meant to me, to know that the recordings had the effect I hoped they would." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes at the warmth in his voice, the absence of the formal distance that had characterized their few previous communications since his departure from royal duties. "Harry, my dear boy, I should be thanking you. Your gift has given me back not only Philip's voice but also a new understanding of so many things I had perhaps viewed too rigidly." The conversation began with both of them sharing memories prompted by the recordings, creating a foundation of shared love for Philip that transcended their recent difficulties. Harry described listening to some of the recordings with his own children, explaining how Archie had been fascinated by great-grandfather's voice and how even Lilibet had seemed to respond to the gentle cadence of Philip's storytelling. "I wish you could see them, Granny," Harry said, his voice carrying a longing that matched Elizabeth's own feelings. "Archie asks about you sometimes, and I realize how much I want them to know you as I did when I was growing up, not just as the queen, but as the grandmother who always had time for bedtime stories and walks in the garden." This opening allowed Elizabeth to address one of the issues that had weighed most heavily on her heart. "I want that too, Harry, more than you know. I've missed so much of their early years, and I realize now that some of that distance was unnecessary, created by misunderstanding and, perhaps too much attention to formal considerations rather than family bonds." As the conversation deepened, they began to address the more difficult aspects of recent family tensions. Elizabeth acknowledged that the institution had perhaps been too slow to adapt to the unique challenges that Meghan faced, and Harry expressed his appreciation for her willingness to see the situation from a different perspective. "I want you to understand, Granny," Harry explained, "that leaving wasn't about rejecting the family or the values you and Grandpapa taught me. It was about finding a way to honor those values while also protecting Meghan and the children from pressures that were becoming genuinely harmful. Grandpapa's recordings helped me understand that he would have supported that decision, even if it looked different from the path he chose." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Harry's interpretation of Philip's teachings. "Your grandfather always said that each generation would face challenges that previous generations couldn't anticipate, and that flexibility and adaptation were signs of strength, not weakness. I think perhaps I was too focused on precedent and not enough on the unique circumstances you were navigating." The conversation took on an even more personal tone when Harry asked about Elizabeth's own well-being in the months since Philip's death. She found herself sharing feelings and struggles that she rarely discussed with anyone, describing the loneliness and questioning that had followed her husband's passing. "The recordings have been a gift not just because they brought back Philip's voice, but because they reminded me of who he was when the cameras weren't recording, when the public wasn't watching. They showed me the man who believed that love and family came first, before everything else, including duty to the crown." Harry's response revealed his own vulnerability and the pain he had carried about the family estrangement. "I've worried about you constantly, Granny, especially knowing how much Grandpapa's death affected you. Part of why I wanted to send those recordings was because I hoped they might provide some comfort during a time when I couldn't be there in person." This admission led to a broader discussion about the practical realities that had made communication difficult. Harry explained how media attention had made even private family communications feel risky, while Elizabeth acknowledged that she had perhaps relied too heavily on formal channels when direct, personal outreach might have been more effective. "I think we both allowed pride and misunderstanding to create barriers that weren't necessary," Elizabeth admitted. "I was hurt by some of the public statements, but I realize now that I didn't sufficiently consider the pressure you were under or the pain that prompted those revelations." Harry expressed his own regrets about the way some issues had become public, while also explaining the impossible situation he and Meghan had faced when private attempts at resolution seemed ineffective. "We felt like we had tried to address things privately, and, when that didn't work, the pressure to speak publicly became overwhelming. But I regret that it caused you pain, and I want you to know that love and respect for you never diminished, even when we disagreed about approach." The most emotional moment of the conversation came when Harry called Meghan and the children to join the video call briefly. Elizabeth's face lit up when she saw Archie, now tall enough to stand easily beside his father, and little Lilibet, whose shy smile and obvious resemblance to Harry filled the Queen's heart with joy. "Hello, Gongon," Archie said, using the name Harry had taught him for his great-grandmother, and Elizabeth felt her composure nearly break at the natural affection in his voice. "Hello, my darling boy," she responded, her voice warm with grandmother love. "You've grown so much since I last saw you. Are you taking good care of your little sister?" The brief interaction with the children was both heartwarming and poignant, highlighting how much family connection had been lost to misunderstanding and how much remained to be rebuilt. Meghan appeared briefly as well, and her warm greeting and obvious pleasure at seeing Elizabeth suggested that the path forward might include healing for all the family relationships that had been strained. After the children left to continue their day, Harry and Elizabeth continued talking for another hour, discussing practical questions about future visits and communication. Harry expressed hope that the family might be able to gather for Elizabeth's official birthday celebrations, though both acknowledged that such arrangements would require careful planning given ongoing security concerns and media attention. "What matters most to me," Elizabeth said as their conversation neared its end, "is that we've found our way back to each other. The specific arrangements can be worked out over time, but knowing that love remains strong despite all the difficulties, that's what Philip's recordings helped me understand, and what I most needed to know." Harry's final words before ending the call carried the warmth and affection that had characterized their relationship during his childhood. "I love you, Granny, and I'm so grateful that Grandpapa's gift could help us find this path back to each other. He always believed that family could overcome anything if love remained at the center." After the call ended, Elizabeth sat quietly for a long time, processing the emotions and possibilities that the conversation had generated. She felt genuinely hopeful about the future for the first time in months, not just regarding her relationship with Harry but about the broader family dynamics that had been so strained by recent events. The conversation had demonstrated that beneath all the public controversy and institutional concerns, the fundamental bonds of love and respect remained intact. Philip's recordings had provided the key to unlocking communication that had seemed impossible, and Harry's generous spirit had created space for healing that both of them clearly wanted. Angela Kelly found the Queen later that evening, still in her sitting room, listening once again to one of Philip's recordings. But, this time, instead of tears, Elizabeth's face showed peaceful contentment and genuine anticipation for the future. "Your Majesty, how did the conversation proceed?" Angela asked gently. "Beautifully, Angela. It went beautifully. I think Philip would be very pleased with what his recordings have accomplished. We found our way back to each other, and I believe we're going to be just fine." That night, Elizabeth went to sleep feeling more at peace than she had since Philip's death. The bridge between her and Harry had not only been rebuilt but had been strengthened by honest communication and mutual understanding. The recordings had accomplished what formal diplomacy and institutional mediation had been unable to achieve. They had reminded everyone involved that love was the foundation upon which everything else could be rebuilt. 6 weeks had passed since that transformative video call, and the effects of Harry's thoughtful gift continued to ripple through the royal family in ways that no one could have anticipated. The Queen's birthday had arrived with a significance that extended far beyond the usual ceremonial observances, marking not just another year of her remarkable life but also the renewal of family bonds that had seemed irreparably damaged just months before. Elizabeth stood in the green drawing room at Windsor Castle, watching through the tall windows as final preparations were made for the small, private birthday gathering that would take place later that afternoon. For the first time in over 2 years, Harry, Meghan, and the children would be joining the family celebration, their presence made possible by the bridge of understanding that Philip's recordings had helped construct. The past weeks had been filled with careful planning and gentle coordination, as family members worked to create an environment where healing could continue and new memories could be made. The Queen had insisted on keeping the gathering intimate and informal, understanding that grand ceremonial occasions might create pressure that could hinder the delicate process of rebuilding relationships. Sarah had noticed the change in the Queen's demeanor over the past weeks, a lightness and energy that seemed to emanate from deep satisfaction rather than mere duty. The anticipation of seeing her great-grandchildren again had given Elizabeth a sense of purpose and joy that complemented rather than competed with her constitutional responsibilities. "Your Majesty seems particularly radiant this morning," Sarah observed as she helped arrange the Queen's jewelry. "There's something different about your bearing these days, if I may say so." Elizabeth smiled, catching her own reflection and seeing something that had been missing for too long, genuine happiness that reached her eyes and softened the formal composure that decades of public life had made second nature. "I think, Sarah, that I'm discovering what Philip always knew, that the strength to fulfill public duty comes from the foundation of private love. These past weeks have reminded me that being queen and being a grandmother are not opposing roles but complementary ones." The morning brought a steady stream of well-wishers and official presentations, but Elizabeth found herself moving through the formal requirements with unusual lightness, her attention partly focused on the afternoon's private celebrations. She had spent considerable time over the past weeks listening to more of Philip's recordings, discovering conversations and advice that she hadn't heard during her initial emotional encounter with Harry's gift. One recording in particular had become especially meaningful to her as she prepared for the family gathering. It captured Philip talking to Harry about the nature of forgiveness and reconciliation, advice that seemed remarkably prescient given recent events. "The thing about family arguments," Philip's voice had counseled, "is that they often happen because people care so deeply about each other that they can't bear to see those they love making what they perceive as mistakes. But real love requires trusting the people we love to make their own decisions, even when those decisions look different from what we might choose ourselves." Philip had continued with characteristic wisdom, "The strongest families aren't the ones that never disagree, but the ones that know how to come back together after disagreement. That requires everyone involved to care more about the relationship than about being right, and to remember that love doesn't require uniformity of thought or approach." Those words had guided Elizabeth through the sometimes challenging process of rebuilding trust with Harry and Meghan. There had been honest conversations about past hurts, acknowledgement of mistakes on various sides, and gradual construction of new ways of relating that honored both family bonds and individual autonomy. Charles had initially been somewhat skeptical about the rapid pace of reconciliation, concerned that institutional considerations were being subordinated to personal emotions. But even he had been moved by the obvious sincerity of Harry's gesture and the positive changes in the Queen's well-being that had resulted from renewed family connection. During one particularly meaningful conversation, Charles had shared his own regrets about how family dynamics had evolved, acknowledging that the pressures of his position as heir had sometimes prevented him from being the father he had wanted to be. The process of healing between Elizabeth and Harry had created space for broader family reflection and communication that had been beneficial for everyone involved. William had perhaps been most affected by the changes, as his relationship with Harry had been among the most painfully strained by recent events. But Philip's recordings had included conversations about brotherhood and the special bond between siblings that had helped both brothers begin to rebuild their own connection. The process was gradual and sometimes difficult, but there were encouraging signs that their fundamental love for each other remained strong beneath the accumulated hurts and misunderstandings. Catherine had played a particularly positive role in facilitating healing, her natural warmth and diplomatic skills helping to create comfortable environments for difficult conversations. She had developed a genuine friendship with Meghan during their early acquaintance, and her presence had helped ease some of the tension that formal royal gatherings might otherwise have created. As afternoon approached, Elizabeth made her way to the private sitting room where the birthday gathering would take place. The room had been decorated simply but warmly, with photographs from happier family times displayed prominently and flowers from the castle gardens creating an atmosphere of natural beauty rather than formal grandeur. The Queen had specifically requested that the afternoon be documented photographically, not for public release but as private family memories. She realized that she had too few candid photographs of recent family interactions, and she wanted to ensure that the rebuilding of relationships was captured for future generations to understand and appreciate. When Harry, Meghan, and the children arrived, the reunion was both emotional and joyful. Archie, now more confident with his great-grandmother, immediately engaged her in conversation about his interests and activities in California. Lilibet, though still quite young, seemed drawn to Elizabeth's gentle manner and was soon comfortable enough to sit beside her on the sofa. Gone, Archie announced with the seriousness that children bring to important declarations. Daddy played me some of great-grandpapa's stories, and they're really good. He talks funny, but I like his voice. Elizabeth laughed with genuine delight at this assessment of Philip's distinctive way of speaking. Yes, darling, he did have a very particular way of telling stories, didn't he? Would you like me to tell you some stories about your great-grandpapa that he might not have recorded? This request led to an afternoon of storytelling that captivated not just the children but the adults as well. Elizabeth found herself sharing memories of Philip that she hadn't recounted in years, stories that revealed his humor, his curiosity, his sometimes exasperating but always endearing quirks, and his deep love for family. Meghan proved to be a particularly engaged listener, asking thoughtful questions about royal history and family traditions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Her American perspective on some British customs brought fresh insights that amused and enlightened the entire group. I have to admit, Meghan said during one conversation about royal protocol, I'm still learning to navigate some of the traditions, but I'm beginning to understand that many of them exist to create structure that actually supports family life rather than restricting it. This observation led to a broader discussion about how traditions could be adapted to serve contemporary needs while maintaining their essential meaning and value. Elizabeth found herself surprisingly open to hearing different perspectives on customs she had observed for decades, recognizing that flexibility and evolution were signs of institutional health rather than weakness. The highlight of the afternoon came when Harry presented Elizabeth with one additional recording that he had kept separate from the original collection. This final piece was Philip speaking directly to Elizabeth herself, a message he had recorded in the weeks before his death but had asked Harry to deliver only when he felt the time was right. My darling Elizabeth, Philip's voice began, speaking with the intimate tone reserved for their most private moments together. By the time you hear this, I'll likely be gone, but I wanted to leave you with some thoughts that I hope will bring you comfort during the difficult days ahead. The room fell silent as Philip's voice continued, speaking with remarkable clarity about his gratitude for their life together, his pride in her service to the nation, and his hopes for the family's future. The thing I want you to remember most of all, Philip said, is that the love we built together, the family we created, the values we tried to instill, these things will continue long after we're both gone. But they will only flourish if you remember that love requires flexibility, that families need space to grow and change, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give those we love is the freedom to find their own path. Philip's final words were specifically about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Let them surprise you, my darling. Let them teach you new things. Let them love you not just because you're the queen, but because you're their grandmother who has stories to tell and wisdom to share. The monarchy will survive and thrive because it adapts, but our family will thrive because it loves. As the recording ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, but the tears were tears of gratitude and connection rather than pure sadness. Philip's words had provided exactly the guidance that Elizabeth needed to navigate the changing family dynamics while remaining true to her deepest values. The birthday celebration continued into the evening, with multiple generations sharing stories, playing with the children, and simply enjoying each other's company in a way that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The Queen found herself thinking that this was exactly the kind of family gathering Philip would have loved, informal, genuine, filled with laughter and affection rather than ceremony and obligation. As the California family prepared to return to their temporary London residence, Harry approached his grandmother with obvious emotion. "Granny, I can't thank you enough for today, for these past weeks, for everything. Grandpapa would be so pleased to see how his recordings brought us back together." Elizabeth embraced her grandson, holding him close in a way that conveyed decades of love and the promise of continued connection despite geographic distance. "Harry, my dear boy, you gave me the greatest gift possible. You helped me remember that being queen is important, but being your grandmother is irreplaceable." Philip's recordings didn't just bring back his voice, they reminded me of who I am beyond the crown. As she prepared for bed that night, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun just weeks before with Harry's simple wooden box. The recordings had accomplished something that formal diplomacy, institutional mediation, and well-meaning advice had been unable to achieve. They had reminded everyone involved that love was stronger than disagreement, that family bonds could survive strain and distance, and that healing was possible when people approached each other with genuine openness and humility. The wooden box now occupied a permanent place on Elizabeth's bedside table, a nightly reminder that Philip's wisdom continued to guide and comfort her. But, more than that, it had become a symbol of the truth that the most profound gifts were often the simplest ones, expressions of love that spoke directly to the heart and created possibilities that seemed impossible just moments before. As she settled into sleep on her birthday night, surrounded by the warmth of restored family relationships and the promise of continued healing, Elizabeth felt genuinely grateful for the reminder that even at 96, there was still room for growth, change, and new understanding. Philip's legacy lived on not just in recorded words but in the family bonds that his wisdom had helped rebuild, stronger and more flexible than ever before. The Queen's birthday had indeed been profoundly moved by Harry's thoughtful present, but the true gift had been the discovery that love could overcome any obstacle, that family could heal from any wound, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened not in formal meetings but in quiet moments when people spoke to each other with complete honesty and unconditional love. The story that had begun with loss and estrangement had transformed into one of renewal and hope, guided by the eternal wisdom that the strongest families are built not on the absence of conflict but on the presence of forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to choose love over pride in every moment that mattered.